It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today, and that is Nick Pallo. Nick is the owner and operator of Frogger Wildlife, which they've had for the past 20 years. And their company is based out of Rochester, New York, serving the western part of New York State. Today, Nick is addressing a very popular topic, one that we've gotten a lot of requests to address. And so we're so happy that we found Nick through a recommendation to talk about this topic. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Nick.
All right. So I just want to say hi to everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to share some of my mole knowledge with you all that I've got. We got limited time to talk with this, so I will take some questions at the end of it. And if by chance I don't get to your questions, you can take a screenshot of what we got going on right now. That's got my contact info. You can message me, text me, whatever you got to do to get your questions answered because I know there's a lot of questions when it comes to moles and mole removal, mole control. Um, Also, like you said, quick background on me, but run my own wildlife company for 20 years now around Rochester. We serve all the Finger Lakes in the Rochester area. Um, we do all wildlife, all nuisance wildlife. So everything from moles to coyotes and beavers and stuff. So, but moles have kind of always been my thing. And I noticed a lot of other companies were pushed off by offering mole control. Um, and a lot of them were intimidated by it. So I kind of carved out my own little niche within the industry. With mole removal, and a lot of those companies even refer me now as well. So that's kind of nice with that. We can go to the next slide here. So before we can dig into the moles and the control tactics, we need to brush up on the species real quick, so we know exactly which ones we're talking about. Moles versus voles. The biggest way I tell people to determine the difference between the two is looking at the damage. Um, on the left top of the slide here, you'll see some vole damage. It almost looks like you left the garden hose laying on the grass for a couple weeks and then lifted it up. You'll have these valleys on top of the grass. So vole with a V creates valleys with a V, and they're vegetarians with a V. So that's how you've got your vole, how you're going to remember that. Mole with an M, they create dirt mounds, and they're meat eaters. Okay. So they're eating your worms and your grubs and insects. So that's how you remember the difference. Vole, V, valley vegetation, mole, M, mounds, meat. That's the easiest way I tell people on how to remember the difference between the two. If you look in the bottom of the photo, you'll see they look very similar, to the untrained eye. They're both gray in color. Um, so a lot of people feel like, oh man, I saw a mole scurrying around, on top of the grass. Chances are you saw a vole with a V because they will come topside more often than a mole with an M. Um, but they do look very similar at a glance. Biggest difference is the front of those feet. You'll see the difference on them. The moles have monster front feet on those, and they're pretty much, just literally built for digging. We go to the next slide here. So we have three species of moles in New York that we deal with. We have the hairy-tailed mole, the star-nosed mole, and the eastern mole. And the most common that I tend to deal with is actually the hairy-tailed mole, from my experience anyway. And my favorite, however, is the star-nosed mole. We can go to the next slide here. So the star-nosed is a small mammal native to North America, has 22 fleshy tentacle-like appendages that are filled with 25,000 touch-sensitive cells called Emer's organs. And the star actually acts as a tool to detect vibrations and chemical signals in the soil and the water. And the star nose is considered the fastest forager among mammals, and they're actually semi-aquatic, which is really neat. Next slide. Mole breeding and the life cycle here. Let's get into that. So breeding takes place late winter, January, February, in there, around here. And then the gestation period of them is 45 days. and then they're sexually mature at 10 months and the lifespan of 2 to 3 years in the wild. So it's not like mice and rats and other critters that may reproduce a few times a year. These guys, it's once a year, thankfully. Um, but as you can see, I mean, by the time they're born to the time it's comes to breeding season, they're already sexually mature, at that point to reproduce again. Um, Next slide. Mole, like I touched briefly a minute ago, their diet consists of mostly worms, insects, grubs. They have a high metabolism rate similar to bats, requiring them to eat 70 to 100% of their body weight in food each day. Um, they tend to follow the worm line in the soil, meaning the drier the weather, the further down the worms go, and they'll go down deeper for them down there. Um, and they'll remain active deep in the soil, making it appear as though they may have actually moved on, but they're actually there. They're just, a foot and a half down versus in the top 2 inches of your yard. Then oftentimes you get a heavy rain, or if you water your lawn, bring those worms back up to the surface, um, and they will begin, feeding on worms again and following them. As somebody just asked if they eat the jumping worms, yes, they'll eat the jumping worms as well. Um, Same goes for the winter months. They remain active below the frost line where your worms are. So these guys don't go dormant. They don't hibernate. They just kind of follow that line. Oftentimes you'll see yards actually in the winter months with dirt mounds pushed up through the snow. And that's because they are still active during that time of the year. It just depends on whether or not it gets really frozen, and then that'll push them down deeper. But if it's just a layer of snow on top of a warm soil, they'll stay active up top there. Let's take a look at the next slide here. So I want to give you a little history on the moles because I always found this fascinating. Moles were actually once considered a fur bearer, believe it or not, and their pelts were harvested and used to make garments, scarves, muffs, even coats at times. They were trapped from around the time of World War I right through the early 1920s. And believe it or not, New York was one of the top producers of mole pelts in the fur trade. In a New York auction in 1917, 71,000 moleskins were sold, and they got a whopping 8.5 cents to 34 cents for them, depending on the quality. And that number increased to 1.2 million moleskins were sold in 1920 in a New York fur sale. Estimated worldwide market between 1923 and 1924 was 10 million moleskins combined from Europe and another 5 million from the U.S. So I guess you can say the 20s were a busy time for some mole removal, mole trapping. So we can go to the next slide here. So mold damage. So let's break this down real quick. The good and the bad. Why are they so bad? People talk, and are there benefits of them? So the obvious downsides are the tunnels that you see, and the thousands in damage that they can do to a yard or collapsing sidewalks and stuff like that. And it's seemingly overnight, really. I mean, it seems to just kind of pop up and all of a sudden you get all this damage. Um, so you have the unsightly mounds that you can rake out, which isn't that big of a deal, but again, it's kind of a nonstop thing. Um, and then the tunneling that they create disturbs your root to soil contact from your grass, and those tunnels where they've been through will eventually, die off if we don't get those compressed back down. So you want to, roll your lawn afterwards. Um, Also, every year I have some clients that talk about, their mother came over and their mother was walking in the yard with the grandkids, and they sunk in a mole tunnel and twisted an ankle, broken ankle. I mean, every year I hear stories about that. If you have horses or livestock, same thing there. They could step into one of these mole tunnels and really get injured in that area. But let's say you're okay with that. What are the benefits? Yes, they absolutely eat insects and grubs and worms and larvae. So I mean, by all means, if you don't mind, the tunneling um, and the dirt mounds that they produce, then I'm all for everybody living in harmony with the animals. Absolutely. There's any sort of um, nuisance removal we do, we always try to weigh the benefits of it and see if it's something we can all live with or not. So if we go to the next slide here, this one pretty self-explanatory. In New York State, moles are classified as unprotected wildlife. You don't need a permit to do anything with them, should you decide to do so. And the methods need to follow humane practices and your local regulations. We're going to get into some of this stuff here. So we'll go to the next slide. BMP's best management practices. Just like with any species, it starts with the habitat and habitat modifications, and moles are no different. So the less water and moisture equals less moles, because they follow that bug line, the worm line. So if you're out there watering your yard every day, and I mean, literally, we see sprinklers. We've all done it. We've all seen it. Sprinklers going in the middle of a rainstorm, and you're like, what are they doing? Um, and it, that's overwatering. If you don't need to water, don't water, because it's just going to, keep the worms and create that habitat for the bugs. And moles are no fools. They're going to follow these guys right to it. Um, Additionally, you can eliminate low spots in the yard that hold moisture, that sort of thing. Cleaning up leaf litter that holds moisture and insects, same thing. So that would be your best management practices there with your habitat modifications. And then we can go to the next slide. These are, some of the stuff I hear about often. Again, the label is the law on any of this stuff, so always follow your labels with it. You got repellents and different stuff that are on the shelves, um, but it's got to be labeled for mole control to be legal in New York State for that. When I hear people saying, "Oh, I put this repellent down and it worked great, the moles disappeared," it's usually just that it timed up with a warmer time of the year and the ground dried out and the moles are there. They've moved over to a shady spot in your yard. They're deeper in the soil, like we talked about, following those worms. So it's not necessarily that the repellent worked. It's usually that they've just moved on to a different area until you start, getting that moisture back again. And then they usually pop back up. So I'm not a huge fan of repellents, but there's a lot of good green repellents on the market that if you wanted to try, I certainly wouldn't be opposed to anybody trying, anything that's green like that. Next slide here. So trapping has always been proven to be like the number one method in terms of mole removal if you're going to do any sort of actual physical removal of the moles. Um, there's literally hundreds of manufacturers um, on the market for mole traps. Um, I don't want to get into actual trap names or brands or anything like that, but what's more important is where you actually put the trap. I will say, out of real quick, the far trap on the right with the spikes that you see there, I don't like, anything above ground when I do trapping. I will say that. I like to have my traps below ground. That eliminates, probably half of the mole traps that are on the market, just because I like it kind of out of sight, out of mind. It's better for kids and pets and everything else to be in the yard. I feel if I've got my traps buried, um, you will never see me rolling up to a house and pulling out a bin of the trap that you see on the far right and setting these medieval looking spike devices around someone's yard. That's not going to happen. But so there's several types on the market, but I'll let you guys kind of pick through that. If we go to the next slide here, we can get into what I was just talking about, which is what's more important than the trap type is where to concentrate your efforts when trapping. Um, we tend to look for straight long runs. They're usually along edging, driveways, foundations, stuff like that. Those are your main highways. Those are, if you're in Rochester, those are your 490s. That's your main area that they're traveling, and they'll travel that every couple of hours. There's other squiggly tunnels that go out into your yard. We often call those feeder tunnels, where they're looking for food, exploring areas. And those ones really, you can tell by looking at them that they don't really have an A to B direction. They're just kind of moving around, following their nose, tunneling with those feet, and just looking for food. I don't typically trap those because they may never even be traveled again. I want tunnels that are traveled often, because I want this to, when I'm doing this for business, I want it to, be over and done with as soon as we can. The faster I close it down, the better off, everybody is with it. So you'll see me trapping these edges. Now, if you notice the far left photo there, kind of ironic, the far left side of that photo, you'll see that little yellow triangle looking thing. That's an ultrasonic device that the customer actually has in the lawn. And you can see I trapped a mole right next to it. So I often do trap right next to those vibrating ultrasonic devices. I kind of feel it rings the dinner bell for the worms and gets them moving. Um, and believe it or not, I feel the moles know it. And I do often trap and catch right next to those mole, vibrate devices there. Let's take a look at the next slide here. Um, I get a lot of questions on how many moles per area of damage are we looking for? Okay. So typically speaking, if you've got damage in the front left corner of your yard by the driveway, and you have damage in the back right corner of your yard, those two areas there, maybe one or two moles in each of them. It kind of just depends, obviously, on the area. There's always exceptions, but typically it's 1 to 2 moles per area of damage that I'm looking for. After I trap one, I usually stop everything down, rake it out, so that way I'm able to monitor if new damage happens. Because if they're there and they're still active, they're going to push those tunnels back up, especially those straight edge tunnels we were talking about. So after I trap one, stop everything down, and look literally the next day. And if you still have more to go, you'll know it, because the next day that'll be pushed right back up. Um, so getting into that real quick, also, the most moles I have removed from a single season in 1 yard. That's all, but when I say season, we'll just say during, or early spring to late fall. So the most I've gotten out of one individual yard in a year was 22 hairy-tailed moles, which is a huge exception. I mean, that's not the norm at all. I would say it's, like I say, it's usually 1 or 2 moles per problem area, and then that kind of usually is the end of it, unless the neighbors got moles and then their moles come over, and then we usually got to do, maybe another round of that. And then the most star-nosed moles out of 1 yard, believe it or not, it was 14 in one season. So, and oddly, here's the other weird thing. Both of those record yards were in year 2014. So it'd be kind of interesting to go back and see kind of what weather events we had going on that year or the prior year to create such a bumper crop that year. Next slide. So outside of trapping, physical removal is always an option. If you have time, you can water the lawn in the problematic areas, take a seat with a shovel, and kind of hang out and see what happens when you start seeing that dirt, moving, and the soil getting pushed up. You can kind of quietly approach over there with your shovel and dig underneath it and flop it over. And a lot of times you've got a mole running around. It's kind of a fun thing to do. I have the opportunity to do it about once a year when I'm out setting these jobs up. I'll be setting a trap, but also I look 5 feet over and a dirt mound starts moving. And it's always fun to go over there and kind of dig the shovel underneath it and flop them out. And then too, I can, with my licensing, put them in a bucket and take them to my release site and let them go there. Which also I will mention, since I'm on the subject of live, we typically don't live trap for moles because they're going back to their metabolism rate. If you're to get one in a live trap and then you checked it 24 hours later, more than likely it's already going to be dead, because they got to eat and to stay alive and everything else. So they end up usually just dying in a live trap if you do that. So I find, in my mind, it's more humane to use a trap that's just gonna do its job and 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 snap and be done with it, rather than making them kind of quote unquote starve to death, if you will. So live trapping is typically not a good option, but if I have the opportunity to scoop one up and put it in a bucket while I'm there, I will absolutely do that and take it to one of my release sites and let it go. Next slide. So now let's say you successfully rid your lawn of moles and you don't see any new damage. You know, you did it. What can you do to prevent reinfestation? In a nutshell, you can't ever fully protect your yard against, a reinfestation. I've heard stories about people putting metal plates on the ground and screens around the property to create a barrier, and the moles have still found a way to get back in. You know, whether it's coming topside and going over it or digging way underneath it, or maybe they weren't actually fully gone when they put the metal screening in. I don't know. But from what I've seen over the years, again, 20 years of doing this, um, you're not really going to be able to prevent that. The best thing you can do that I have found is rolling the lawn with a heavy duty asphalt type roller. There's a ton of guys out there that offer this. Most of them are paving companies that are looking to make, some side money, with their asphalt rollers on the weekends. Um, but it's a great opportunity for you to kind of close down those roadways that you may have open, that the moles were utilizing for their traveling. Once you close those roads down, it's a good chance it may help deter what's to come, especially those trails on the edges where your property lines are. Because if you get a new flow of moles, let's say you back up to a wooded area, and they decide that's the trail they're going to take into your property. If you really collapse that down, that would be your best bet to prevent future reinfestation in your yard. Next slide. So with everything said there, just remember, moles don't hate your lawn. They just really dig it. And that's a dad joke. That is a mole trapper dad. So when you go to the next slide here, anybody have any questions?
Well, thanks, Nick. We did get a bunch of questions, even some interesting comments in the chat. Um, because of our time frame today, we're actually going to have to transition to our next presentation, but you can feel free to enter some answers in the chat, or we can collate those questions, get them to you, and then put them in the video description at a later date. But we really appreciate your presentation. We'd
Yeah,
like to focus on identification up front so you know who you're dealing with, and then some practical solutions. So thank you so much for your time. Um,
no problem at
at
all. Thank you.
Great. At this time, I'll ask our next presenter to bring up their slides. Great. So our IPM Minute speaker today is Dr. Amara Dunn-Silver. She is the biocontrol specialist at Cornell IPM, and you know her as the co-host of this First Friday series. And so today, Amara will be talking to us about our ongoing series of feeding friendly insects. We're at step 6, which is wait to clean up your garden. So you can take it away, Amara.
Thanks so much, Matt. So this is a picture from my garden. Actually, this week, you can see it looks a little messy. You can see I've got some dead leaves and stems from last year still around the bulbs and perennials that are coming up. And I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes letting you know why it's okay to do this, at least in some parts of your garden. So just a reminder, for this series, we're talking about friendly insects or beneficial insects, by which I mean either pollinators, like this cute bumblebee visiting this false indigo plant, or insects that help you with pest control, like this lacewing larva that's on this pink echinacea flower. We've been talking about how to provide these beneficial insects with food and shelter and also protection, which is the focus of today's step. You'll see this QR code a few times on the next few slides. This is going to take you to the Cornell IPM page that's all about creating habitat for beneficial insects. And just letting you know that we're focused on perennials here. Not that annual flowers can't also feed friendly insects, but perennials are our focus here. Last year, our steps focused on how do we put these perennial plants in the ground and get them growing. And this year, we're talking about maintenance, which brings us to step 6, which is wait to clean up your garden in spring. So today's IPM Minute for April is really about doing less rather than doing more. By delaying your spring garden cleanup, you are protecting insects that may be hibernating under leaves, in stems, whether those stems are still standing or fallen down, and giving them time to emerge naturally as the temperatures get warmer. So our motto here is messy garden, no problem. And these are just some of the beneficial insects that you can be protecting by leaving a little bit of mess in your garden. Whether it's a stem nesting bee like this bee on the left, fireflies whose larvae need leaves to hide in over the winter. Lots of different lady beetle species. Here I have a pink spotted lady beetle and a twice stabbed lady beetle, and also ground beetles, which are great predators of things like slugs, but they also eat weed seeds. A lot of folks want to know, but when can I start cleaning up my garden? People really want to tidy their gardens. The reality is that since we have so many beneficial insects that we're potentially protecting, there's no single date I can give you. You should at least wait until your taxes are submitted, at least April 15th, but longer would be better, perhaps until you start mowing your lawn regularly when it has warmed up enough to require that. Or you could wait until apple and pear trees are finished blooming, which around here in central New York is usually mid-May. Or if you are really committed to messy garden, no problem, you could wait until you're ready to plant your tomatoes outside, which would be when night temperatures are regularly above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. We just heard in our last presentation that cleaning up leaves can help you with mole management. So for this step in feeding friendly insects, as in all of them, remember it doesn't have to be all or nothing. If you want to pick some parts of your yard or garden where you're going to clean up leaves, either because of mole concerns or tick concerns or something else, go for it. You are not a bad gardener. But if there's areas where you can leave a little bit more mess, you will be feeding these good insects that you want to keep in your garden. And that is all I have for you today on feeding friendly insects. I will be back next month where we're going to talk about recognizing the seedlings of those wildflower seeds that you planted last fall. So thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Amara.